Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. When interviewed, Stephen Dupont, the Australian freelance photographer, considered the subtlety and authority of a single photograph. It's a nice background noise. It has the greatest power to instill memory into people, he observes, and that's why they talk about the iconic photographs of our time. They're what we remember. Much has been written about memorable images depicting human rights and suffering, and the debates often revolve around whether these photographs are exploitative or didactic. And the expanding historiography, the experiences and memories of the photographers themselves are often ignored. What do they consider to be their role, and what constrains their photographic enterprise? Similarly, the history of newspaper photography is often overlooked and illuminates the treatment and recognition of human rights images in Australia. So my paper today is very much about Australia and about the press photographers as well. Fundamentally, the idea of power is premised on photographs being seen. Using the oral accounts of past and present newspaper photographers and picture editors and the images themselves, this paper will reveal their voices, their motivations, their vernacular. They talk about pictures rather than photographs, for example, and the ethics when photographing and viewing and now sharing images of human rights. Photographing suffering to record and confirm genocide and human rights abuses have since the Holocaust influenced the newspaper enterprise. But in Australia, it's actually been less linear. And the photographers emphasise this power and the importance of taking and looking at uncomfortable images. They frequently alert us to the limitations of their work and whether they produce change or not. So the presentation today, in many ways, I want to think about the idea that there is an abiding commitment to cover stories of international human rights violations by the photographers themselves, but photographing the marginalised and dispossessed mattered to them. But three issues surrounding news photography have compromised their role and advocacy. The first is the commercial and editorial imperatives. The second is the privileging of national and political priorities which prevent the dissemination and circulation of dangerous images. And last are the cultural limits of empathy across racial lines. And these constraints point to the power and the suspicion of the imagery, its visibility and invisibility. This presentation is drawn from 60 oral history testimonies with newspaper photographers. I'm deliberately not showing two photographers' images today, and that's Ali Bharat Ali Bator, who's in the audience, who was the youngest photographer we interviewed. The oldest was born in 1921, and it was Lloyd Brown. The other person I'm not showing is David Dare Parker, who will talk about his work this afternoon. The National Library holds these interviews, and they requested whole-of-life interviews. So it meant that sometimes we were interviewing up to 7 hours, which emphasised the significance of oral history and me eating a lot of donuts, but it also allowed time and trust and space for the photographers to ruminate on their personal stories. So while photographing humanitarian crisis was not the sole purpose of the interviews, what was striking is actually these stories were told constantly with all sorts of ethical sort of situations and dilemmas that were raised. Firstly, though, I think it's important to think about the historic use and parallel ideas about the role of press photography in Australia, and it has always been inconsistent. Photography captured the Australian imagination, but it was only in the 1920s when pictorial newspapers picked it up. The broadsheets were far more resistant to the idea of the image, which they thought was actually demeaning. It was too tabloid, for example. So they continued to be resistant. There was a corresponding disjuncture about the function of the newspaper image. From the inception, there was a tension between the photograph as a form of art, as entertainment, and as a means of representation which was constantly debated. Many photographers struggled with the polarity between these photographic objectives, and still to this day. The Western representation of the liberation of the concentration camps in April 1945 revealed a critical new role, photographs as proof. And I should preempt this. I'm showing a couple of images that are graphic, and also one image of an Aboriginal activist that has since died. So if you want to avert your eyes, please do. So that idea about proof was the new sort of tenet as well. It's not just about entertainment. It was the images of the liberation of the concentration camps in Germany which established the show me phenomena. Barbie Zelizer argues that the liberation photos became the main event of the journalistic record for one of the few times in the history of the daily and weekly press in the US and Britain. It wasn't such the case in Australia. The photographs of the Jewish dead in the Nazi-occupied territories did not appear in Australian newspapers, and images of the persecution from 1933 were treated inconsistently. There was a couple of exceptions of trophy photographs, and I put that in inverted commas, that were published. And this is one such photograph that was published by the Daily Telegraph, which was probably one of the most responsible newspapers. And for Australians, you might actually shrug and see the certain irony in that. But they actually relentlessly covered the Holocaust and the persecution previously. The other point to note is no Australian photographer was accredited to the European theatre, and it points to this constraint that I began this paper with. Australian nationalism influenced the entire structure of Australian journalism during the war, and the lionised exploits of our soldiers took precedence over the plight of European and Soviet civilians. To put it in crude perspective, they missed the greatest scoop in the vital 2 months of 1945, the visual representation of the camps and their revelation. Visually, Australian newspapers looked inward with more comforting narratives of our returned boys, despite the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, and the Holocaust, which became a central narrative of World War II and human rights. For Australia, the visual representation was relegated in importance. The one photographer, and actually he was an artist, that did cover this was an artist by the name of Alan Moore, who remained in Bergen-Belsen camp for 3 days painting, and he was told by a Welsh soldier to take photographs because no one would believe it. And so Alan Moore did. Alan Moore tried to donate his work to the Australian War Memorial, who didn't take it until 1969. And only in 2016, this year, has the Australian War Memorial put on a larger exhibition. The Holocaust imagery ushered a couple of changes, but very slowly. The photographs revealed their evidential value and lent a moral clarity to the photographic endeavour. And the sheer power set a precedent in documenting the way photographers approached human rights, the hunt for bodies, using a description. Also, one of the most overused expressions was the caption, "the image that shocked the world," which we still read, that galvanising of action, which is or not, sort of has to be tested. These changes in Australia were not immediate. I'm just about to show you a violent photograph if you want to avert your eyes. They were published indiscriminately with the express motivation to shock rather than inspire advocacy, empathy and induce action. The victims were accorded less humanity than the soldiers, and I'll let you have a look. So the soldiers were dressed, the soldiers were given names, the mass survivors were not. And in many ways the dead were privileged in the photographs more than those that had survived. By the 1960s, and again there's another image of Australians liberated. By the 1960s, photographs became more critical in Australian newspapers, and the visual conventions changed. Imagery chronicling social and political change were published more frequently. The function of news photography is imposed by hierarchical routines, and it's important to signal them here to understand the visual representation. Press photography has entrenched traditions, practices and values. These signify the filters through which the day's photographs are routinely published. Gatekeeping is the process of inclusion and exclusion of images, and the selection and discarding process found most editorial decisions were based on purely subjective reasons. There is a hierarchy that classifies editorial photographs, and the selection and viewing of newspaper images were determined by editors, depending on the relationship, sometimes in consultation with the picture editor. The photographers had little agency. In many ways, some of the photographers talk about what their role is, It's not always about, it's about taking the picture, getting the moment. The editor also determines story assignments. The press was historically under-resourced. Subsequently, most images of human rights or international crises were taken from wires or were disseminated by the Australian Associated Press rather than Australian photographers, who were rarely sent overseas, except for sporting events. Constrained by these considerations and national narratives, editors were reluctant to actually invest, and many photographers committed to covering international stories about the disenfranchised had to self-fund their assignments, supported by empathetic editors. So until the 1980s, most staff photographers missed vital moments in the national and international history. Most newspapers use freelance and stringers, and continue to this day, who have produced much of what we know about the Middle East and Africa. Few are sent by media organisations and are not given financial assistance, support, training or insurance. And it is these freelancers who are prepared to spend and fund years gaining the trust of the community. Their photographs often reveal their intimacy. For those committed to showing the experiences of Indigenous Australians and telling their stories in a more nuanced way, they too had to campaign their editors for the time and luxury. I'm quoting Ray Martin, which is a bit of a surprise for the Australians, but go with me. He says, and I apologise, I well recall that generations of newspaper editors and hacks when I first started out, with the tedious racist maxim that, I quote, "Abos don't sell newspapers," that commercial imperative of newspapers and the historically favoured narratives, often constrained and also, of course, prevented nuance. But despite these press photographers we interviewed cite their stories of Indigenous news as some of the most important and remarkable. Brian Charlton nominates his photographs of Aboriginal protests, the Royal Commissions on British nuclear tests at Maralinga, and into Aboriginal deaths in custody in 1987. Laurie Graham, who's another fantastic photographer, talks about her first big story on Aboriginal land rights. The evolution of news photography shows us that human rights was represented and the role of photography had changed. And self-definition is also important. We have to remember photojournalism as an expression was not used in Australia. They were often called snappers instead. In contrast to photographers producing portraiture or documentary photographs, press photographers were regarded as butchers because there was pressure on them to deliver the news. The photographers we interviewed reflected on their role. For many, it was to get the picture or capture the moment. I'll let you read that quote. For others, it was actually there was nothing altruistic about that moment and about that process. Our interviews reveal complicated and changing responses to the role of photography in shaping our understanding. Kate Garrity is one of Australia's most feted newspaper photographers, and she spent 6 months in 2016 documenting the refugee crisis in Europe. And what she wanted to do, what her aim was to do, is actually to show that they were more humane in their interaction, and that we were hoping, she says, to start a conversation about how other people treated refugees. Garrity was not alone in her determination to represent humanity and provoke debate. Several photographers who had close contact with asylum seekers were shaped by these experiences. Photographs of human rights bring with them a set of particular ethical responsibility. Indeed, the media have a unique obligation to manage... Sorry, I don't need that. Oh, wait a minute. No, sorry. Have a unique obligation to manage our encounter with distant and potentially traumatic events. The photographers we interviewed reflected on their personal motivations and the dilemmas surrounding beautiful suffering. I quote, Lily Chiraki alerts us to the politics of pity, the challenges of reporting on human suffering, and the responsibility to protect viewers from trauma, but simultaneously inviting a moral response. There were conflicting testimonies from the people we interviewed about the binary of revulsion and attraction, with an acknowledgement of privilege in the intersections between the powerful and the powerless. Bowers describes here the war photographs from Kosovo as almost suffering as an art form. And Laurie Graham, another photographer, reflects on the duality of viewing powerful images. It can be used for good. I think it's like journalism. It can be used for great good and it can be exploitive. Many of the photographers we interviewed discussed the power and the limits of images of suffering. Beyond the undoubted commercial appeal, terrible things can make beautiful pictures, Tony Ashby told us. But they often speak eloquently, also, the photographers, about the powerful instrument the camera can be, that they instill sometimes memory more than moving images. And for photographers, memory as well as the visual has centrality in their work. The photographers' responses conveyed the collective professional photography and interpretations of photographs, with a particular nod to the Holocaust imagery, the iconic photographs of Vietnam, and more recently Elaine Kurdi. Life magazine loomed large in the older generation's collective memory. Unlike personal memory, whose authority fades with time, the authority of collective memories increased, taking on new complications, fabrications and omissions. So some of them talk about the idea that the Vietnam War, which is now known as the Vietnam Syndrome, that had a pacifist agenda, that these images stopped the war, and there's been a lot of debate that that's actually not what happened. There were also the individual memories that emerge. Verity Chambers recalled vividly the photograph of a buried child taken after the Bhopal industrial disaster in India, and Mike Bowers believes at the very best, the best picture can change what we think. The photographers we interviewed also reflect on the images that aroused outrage and that were meaningful to them. Kate refers to the photograph of Abdallah here, who arrived on a dinghy on the shores of Italy. And this is how she tried to make sense, that she actually wanted to capture a moment. She wanted to provide humanity. Rather than the mass, it's the individual. The conversation Garrity signalled earlier is not easy. Proximity, culturally, racially and geographically, is inexplicably linked to the news values. There are memorable sites, but other equally cruel conflicts and events in which civilians are relentlessly slaughtered but have gone relatively underreported and photographed. And these espouse certain cultural assumptions. The hierarchy of death, of pity, is most often associated with Africa, Asia and the Middle East. The imbalance is geopolitical, showing atrocity abroad tends to be more acceptable. There's more circumcision in what is shown of atrocities closer to home. And certainly the visual images associated mass death in a non-Western world and reveal what is more acceptable to show. Since the 1930s, the press has negotiated how to represent the body. In 1938, the AJA, the Associated Journalists Association, the union, demanded that no photographs of local corpses should be published. And as recently as 1997, the Australian Press Council conceded that the publication of pictures of dead bodies presented them with difficulties, but they adopted a general approach that there is a difference between photographs of the unidentified victims of foreign carnage and a front picture of a body in a local community. Photographs of rotting corpses dominated the limited visual coverage of the Rwandan genocide, headlined as a tribal bloodbath rather than more nuanced analysis of the events. Tony Ashby, however, managed to provoke empathy when he photographed the dead body of a beautiful little girl, as he described it. The Western Australia somewhat reluctantly ran the picture, but the impact was striking and provoked a great debate about the Rwandan genocide. The iconography of vulnerable children in war-ravaged places and their precarious and ambiguous relationship with both risk and nostalgia is prescient. And in the case of foreign news, proximity is not only about geographical distance. But the cultural resonance and circulation of uneven treatment when considering the representation of human rights in Australia is actually quite striking. The photographers note the political and cultural hypocrisy. Australia arguably has the most restrictive immigration control regime in the world, making widespread use of offshore detention facilities. And what emerged in many of our interviews was this frustration about what was going on. One of the key aspects of media reporting, and I'm not talking about Tampa, it's way too much, but subsequent events that occurred, was the way to control the photographers. Several photographers viewed this as a determined effort to prevent the humanising images of asylum seekers. So people like Angela Wiley deliberately tried to show the one face, or a number of different faces. Laurie Graham pointed out that Australian journalists and photographers are not allowed to actually get to know or interview or even to name or give a backstory, which points to the fine documentary in the previous session. In recent years, visual control has included photographers and journalists being intimidated or worse. In 2001, Angela Wiley, when she went to Nauru, deliberately tried to show a humanity. And Kate Geraghty also refers to the deliberate policy. We're not actually allowed to interview or to name them. So Kate tried a different way of showing humanity when she couldn't get any access at all, get them to show their own names. You've got to care about this person, she says. Mike Bowers was on Christmas Island as debate raged over the Australian government's response to Tampa. And he talked about the debate and also the deliberate policy about putting a face to it. Just months later, it now costs, and this was in 2001, $8,000 application fees for press visits to Nauru, which effectively controlled a limited media presence. Mike Bowers tried to get into Nauru and they put that fee up. In the midst of this limited access, there's been a shift in war and human rights imagery, which is now diffused through a mesh of new media. Professional and amateur videos, podcasts, blogs, documentaries, video sharing sites such as Flickr and YouTube, and social media. It was the social media and the dissemination of photographs, particularly of children and women, which allowed viewers greater access to shocking material from places such as Gaza last year. At the same time, there are millions of images which are potentially lost. Renee Nautagi, who's still a photographer with the News Corp, tells us there's a total understanding of what the power of photographs are, and I think you've got to find and look for these images. I've just done it, they've warned me about that. This photograph, which won an award for Warren Richardson, wasn't picked up by any newspapers, but it was actually able to be disseminated and circulated. Multimedia platforms and close collaboration have mitigated deadline pressures and provided greater opportunities to newspaper photographers like Kate Geraghty, whose expose of the widespread use of rape as a weapon of war and the impact of war on civilian populations living in refugee camps in the Congo received great acclaim. Previously, sexual violence in warfare was rendered visually invisible. The public are now active consumers, and no doubt everyone can think about Aileen Kurdi, but whether it actually, and it does in that case, change policy, but those languishing in Manus and Christmas Island were virtually ignored, and other narratives emerged about the Kurdi case. Several photographers speculated on the representation of human rights, on the representation of human rights in the digital age. Renee Nautagi refers or alerts us to visual fatigue, the relentless circulation of photographs. Everywhere they look, they see grief. And the internet has complicated ethics. It allows for more graphic visuals and has removed editorial gatekeeping. Graham elaborates, it's really weird at the moment, she says, this whole process also of everybody's a photographer, where those questions aren't necessarily asked of those picking up their iPhones. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And is there consent? And at the heart of the historic representation of human rights in newspaper photography is the power to humanise and the determination, or not, of either culturally, politically and editorially to prevent the discourse. Geraghty argues that in many ways the role is unchanged. The basis or core element of what we do, she says, is to tell people's stories. The ethics of it don't change, or the heart of it doesn't change. I think people come to you to tell their story, or you go and find them if there's an absence of justice. Thank you.